But he used his acceptance speech to lay down the principles of a foreign policy he hoped to follow, a sophisticated grappling with the tensions between idealism and realism. It was a daring speech for a Peace Prize recipient. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, he said. It is a recognition of history, the imperfection of man, and the limits of reason. Nations must adhere to standards that govern the use of force, and a just, lasting peace must be based on the inherent rights and dignity of every individual. Still, America cannot act alone, except on matters of vital national interest. And mere lofty rhetoric about human rights only sustains a crippling status quo. Engagement with repressive regimes may lack the satisfying purity of indignation, but no repressive regime can move down a new path unless it has the choice of an open door. Benjamin Rhodes, Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, said, "When people ask me to summarize Obama's foreign policy, I tell them to take a close look at that speech." Another former top White House official called it a template to how he approaches problems, a framework for how he thinks about U.S. power. Whether he followed the template, how he grappled in action with the tensions he recognized in theory, would be, by his own standard, the measure of his presidency. The early years of Obama's term were taken up with challenges inherited from the Bush administration, especially the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. At the start of 2011, however, a string of new problems emerged as domestic protests against authoritarian leaders broke out across the Middle East. The Ben Ali regime in Tunisia fell in January, and the Mubarak regime in Egypt followed in early February. By late February, rebels opposed to the Libyan dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi had seized control in cities such as Benghazi, and the dictator's days seemed numbered. But then the tide of war reversed, and Gaddafi's forces moved to crush the uprising. With tens of thousands of civilian lives at risk, the Obama administration, which had come out in support of the rebels, faced a difficult choice. The members of the Arab League were unanimously imploring the United States to get involved. NATO allies were keen to intervene in support of the armed rebels, and a UN Security Council resolution was in the works. At a National Security Council meeting called to discuss the crisis, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Susan Rice, and some of Obama's NSC staff argued for action, citing moral imperatives and the prospect of a truly multilateral force. But according to several people present at the meeting, Pentagon officials opposed intervening, pointing out that the United States had no vital interests in Libya, and that any serious commitment would get Washington bogged down, possibly for years. Two options were set before the president: go in all the way as the leader of an alliance, or don't go in at all. Obama's response was to come up with a third way, which emerged as he thought through the problem out loud. Early on, he articulated the principles that would underlie whatever course he chose. No U.S. boots on the ground, no military action at all unless it had a legal basis and a decent chance of succeeding, and finally, an appropriate division of labor with allies. The U.S. military would provide its unique capabilities, among them precision bombing and intelligence sharing, but U.S. allies, who had a far greater interest in the conflict's outcome, would assume the brunt of protecting Libyan civilians and restoring order after the fighting. In an interview at the time with The New Yorker, an Obama advisor, whose identity remains unknown, dubbed this approach leading from behind, a term that would come in for much derision. But in context, it made sense. And it fit Obama's outlook on the role and limits of military force, the distinction between interests and vital interests, and the need to align the instruments of power with the intensity of those interests. The first phase of the resulting operation was ultimately a success. The combination of U.S. airstrikes and intelligence, NATO air support, and rebel movements on the ground led to the defeat of Gaddafi's forces. And although this was not an explicit aim of the campaign, the killing of the Libyan leader himself. But the second phase was a failure.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.